So we were talking last week about dinosaurs, and modern science, secular science tells us that they died out 64 million years before people showed up. So we were looking at that, looking at evidence that, if the Bible is accurate, God says he created all the animals on the same day as he created man. Dinosaurs are animals. Dinosaurs would have been created the same time man was. So we were looking at evidence about handprints found in the human handprints found in the same rock that dinosaur footprints are in, and footprints found in the same rock, and artistic carvings and paintings that if nobody even knew what dinosaurs were until the mid-1800s, how did people back in the 1200s, 1100s, 1400s know what they looked like and draw things that were accurate and then found later on? So then we also looked at some different stories that people will say, well, they're fantasy. And they describe dinosaur-type creatures, only they use the term dragon because the term dinosaur didn't exist until the 1840s. And if you remember, the original definition of dragon was large serpent. That was it. It was not fire-breathing, mythical, gold-hoarding, live-in-the-cave type creatures. It was just a large serpent. So we looked at several different stories from historians who described creatures that we would consider dragons, but because modern science tells us that they didn't exist at the same time, then those are obviously myths. They're not true stories. They're made up. But are they? Do they have to be? In one example, we were getting ready to start. If you look at this, you see what looks like a serpent with 2 front legs and no back legs. This is very typical of a lot of ancient Chinese drawings, Chinese art. And I told you we were going to talk about Marco Polo tonight. So Marco Polo was from Venice, and he lived in the late 1200s, early 1300s. And from 1271 to 1295, he traveled all over the Silk Road through China, Persia, Tibet, Burma, all through these areas with his uncle and his father. And through his travels, he recorded the people he came into contact with, the customs that they had, rituals that they performed, certain beliefs they had, plants and animals that he came into contact with. And he ended up writing a book about it, which was The Travels of Marco Polo. It's such a huge book, it's been divided into 2 volumes. In chapter 49, Marco Polo talks about some interesting things when he came to a province called Karazhan. And he reports how there were large quantities of gold in the river. He talked about how the citizens there used cowrie seashells as money because they were not common to the area, so they were very rare there. And he describes some of the animals that he encountered. And one of the things he wrote, "Here are found snakes and huge serpents, 10 paces in length and 10 spans in girth." So 10 paces is about 25 to 30 feet long, and 8.3 feet in diameter, so about this big around. And he describes them as having 2 short legs at the front, and each foot has 3 claws on it. He says the eyes were very large, like a loaf of bread, and very glaring. The jaws are wide enough to swallow a man. The teeth are large and sharp, and the whole appearance is so formidable that neither man nor any kind of animal can approach them without terror. And then he says that there are others of smaller sizes, maybe 8, 6, or 5 paces long, and a pace is about 2.5 feet. So, still pretty big serpents. And he goes on in that chapter to talk about how the local citizens there would hunt them and kill them. They were slow moving, they came out at night, they knew how the way that they would drag their bodies. They left what looked like if you grabbed a large telephone pole and drug it through soft dirt. And they would bury spears with iron tips in those pits so that when they crawled down those pits, they would impale themselves and kill themselves. And he's very matter-of-factly describing this, just like he matter-of-factly describes everything else he comes into contact with. And he even talks about how the meat is considered a delicacy and sold at a very high price. He talks about how the gallbladder is harvested and the gall is used for different medications. And he talks about, a teaspoon of gall added to this for this ailment, a little bit, this much gall for this, added to this for this particular ailment. And he's just very matter-of-factly describing it. Much of his writings, when they look at it, they say, oh, it's very accurate, it really describes the people, the cultures, everything he came into contact with, except the serpents, they're fake. And that's because things like that are not supposed to have lived at the same time as human beings. So even though it's just, he describes it the way that if you went on a trip and came back, you'd be like, you won't believe what I saw. I saw these people, these things, they had these animals I've never seen, and this is what they looked like. And he's describing it very matter-of-factly, but people discount it because these things don't exist. At least they don't exist now. They died out 64 million years before people. So he talks about how they were hunted because people were afraid of them. They killed livestock. You know, he goes into detail about harvesting the meat. He goes into detail about uses for the gall and other chemicals that they would get from it. And a lot of things, we have done a very good job as human beings of hunting things to extinction because they're a good food source, they were easy to kill, they were easy to transport. You know, why do we hunt rhinos? Because we believe that the horn, some people believe that the horn has special magical powers. And you grind it up and it acts all sorts of magical medicines. Same thing with ivory tusks on elephants. You know, so people with spears a long time ago had no problem bringing down big bull elephants. So bringing down some of these creatures, if you know their habits, would not be difficult. It would not be impossible for the people to do. And the way he describes it, why would it not be true? You know, so, but hunting to extinction, you know, I was talking about how if dinosaurs coexisted with man, why don't we have them today? And one of the reasons is that we could have hunted them to extinction. You know, one of the things that we read is about the village in England that had the small winged serpents, and the person said, oh yeah, my dad and uncle used to hunt them a lot because they were murder on the livestock and chickens. So they hunted them till they were no more to protect their livestock. You know, there were stories of Native American Indians who hunted large birds because the birds were coming in and taking people out of the villages, but they would live in caves, so they would build fires in front of the caves and kill them that way. Now, another reason, and I forgot to get the clicker, so let me grab the clicker. So another possibility of why we don't still see dinosaurs today could have to do with lifespan. How long did people live before the flood? 900 years. Plus, Adam lived, you know, if we look at all the Genesis in chapter 5, we can see that Adam lived 930 years, Seth 912, Methuselah 969. After the flood, Noah lived 950. And then when we get to the genealogies in chapter 11, we start to see that lifespans quickly drop from 900 years to about 100 to 200 in only 5 generations. So what if reptiles and other animals were also able to live that long? So one of the interesting things about reptiles have what we call indeterminate growth. That means that as long as a reptile is alive and conditions are good, it will continue to grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. We grow to a set size, and from then on we only age. We have determinate growth. And there are several other animals. There are fish. Fish have indeterminate growth. You go to the fair and win the little goldfish, and you keep it in the little bowl and it stays little. But if you get a bigger aquarium, it gets bigger. If you go put it in a lake, those goldfish will be, 4, 5, 6 pounds. They get very large based on the environment that they're in. So if dinosaurs were able to live also 900 years, what would something like this look like if it had 900 years to grow? So one of the things we have to look at is people don't always understand this. We have what's called scale effect. Okay? Think of it like this. If I'm 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, if I was 12 feet tall, how much would I weigh? I would not weigh 400 pounds, I would have to weigh 600 pounds. And it's called the square cube law. And what scale effect says is that when you grow larger, the outside grows much slower than the internal volume. So if I were to double my height, I have to triple my weight. And I found a paper years ago. I tried to find it again. I searched for a few days. I couldn't find it. But there was a biologist who was studying this scale effect in reptiles, and he was saying that if these reptiles grew for years and years and years, centuries, the way that people had the same lifespan, they would look nothing as an adult like they do as a juvenile, because their bones and muscle mass would have to thicken so much in order to support all of that weight that these creatures would look nothing at the full adult size like they do as a young juvenile, because they would just basically deform because of how thick their bones and body would have to be to support the weight. Now, another reason, and this to me is probably the most likely issue, is crashed populations. So this fish right here is a cod. Everybody know what a cod is? Have you ever eaten cod? Cod are very popular. So one of the best cod fisheries in the world is located in what's called the Grand Banks, which is basically just a little bit east of Nova Scotia, Canada, kind of between Nova Scotia and Greenland. And it is some of the most fertile waters as far as cod. In the 1980s, cod became super popular, so people were fishing for them hard because they could make a lot of money. Cod can live a fairly long life for a fish. They can live up to over 15 years. And they do not sexually mature until they're 3 to 4 years old. So they're probably getting into this size range before they're sexually mature and able to reproduce. But they're super expensive, and you can sell them at the restaurant. So fishermen were hitting them so hard, they removed so many breeding adults out of the population that in the 1980s, the fishery crashed. We still have cod because we had other cod fisheries that ended up moving back in, but the cod fishery crashed because so many breeding adults were removed. Now, if people were hunting dinosaurs because they were threats to the people, because the meat was expensive, because the gall and other bodily fluids could be used for medication, we almost hunted whales to extinction for whale oil. So if we're hunting because of all these things and because they're hard on our livestock, hard on our poultry, it wouldn't take long for us to hunt certain creatures to extinction. So these possibilities are just part of the reasons why we may not still see dinosaurs today. There is a theory that there used to be a lot more oxygen in the atmosphere years ago than we have today. And I looked at that, but if you look at some of that oxygen, we actually did have higher oxygen, but then it got lower than we are today, then it got a little bit higher. And some of the reported sightings, the dates and stuff, were still during some of the higher oxygen time periods, and even in the lower. So I don't know that the oxygen played a big part. But one of the things about dinosaurs, because we think of dinosaurs that they're enormous, and how did Noah fit them on the ark? Well, biology tells us that, we know that they started as eggs, and you can't really have an egg much bigger than a football. If an egg gets any bigger than a football, then it's too big for the oxygen to permeate through the shell and to get to the embryo, and the embryo inside cannot survive. So, Noah only had to have something about that big on the ark. And either they grew really fast, which is what secular science thinks. They think that over the first maybe 5 to 10 years, these dinosaurs actually grew really, really fast. Or they lived such long ages that they just simply had time to get that large. And before the flood, we looked at the evidence that maybe all of creation was vegetarian, because God said, I give you every green thing to eat, just like I give every green plant to all the animals. And then after the flood, he says, just like I gave you all the plants, now I give you meat. So if all the animals were vegetarian, little bitty baby dinosaurs didn't have to worry about getting eaten and had 1,600 years to grow to these massive sizes. And then Noah's flood covers up the bones and we find the remains today. I mean, that's possible, yes.
Do you think that all animals were
based on what Genesis says about that he gave all the green plants to all the people and animals, I think so. And then after the flood, he says, now I give you meat to eat. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if part of the wickedness of the world was that people were killing animals, and maybe that even animals were killing other animals, but I don't know that it necessarily meant they had to be eating them. Even grizzly bears are predominantly herbivore. They will eat meat, but they eat a lot of berries and stuff too. I think about 75% of their diet is vegetarian. So the other big question, if they were real, why aren't they mentioned in the Bible? You know, and I know I said last time, I know you're thinking about Behemoth and Leviathan, but at the time we weren't defining the word dinosaur yet. We were using the word dragon. But more than likely, Behemoth and dinosaur are what I would consider to be probably dinosaurs. And we're going to look at specifically about that. But before we do, does anyone have a King James Bible? Or the King James app on your phone? I have it if nobody wants to switch to King James real quick, because I want someone to look up Job 39:9 and read what it says. And it's got to be the King James. It can't be the New King James. 39:9.
Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee or abide by thy thread?
It says, will the unicorn. And if you look at Isaiah 34:7, it says, and the unicorn shall come down with them. And if you look at Psalm 29:6, it says, like a young unicorn. So, is the Bible a fairy tale? I am not suggesting that we have magical one-horned horses running around in the Bible. So, the actual animal referred to here is Re'im. The problem is we don't know what a Re'im is. And we do know that there is a lot of evidence that suggests a Re'im may have been some sort of one-horned cow-like creature, some sort of one-horned bovine. We know that they are supposed to be very aggressive, and around 50 BC, before he became dictator of Rome, Julius Caesar made an odd reference to unicorns in the middle of his account of the Gallic War's violent conflict and power struggles. And he characterized them as being beings that lived in the Hercynian forest, which was a large old-growth forest that stretched across Central Europe. And he said, unlike the horse-like creatures with the spiraled horn that we have in our mythology, he described them as having the body of a stag, the tail of a boar, the head of a horse, the limbs of a moose, and a distinctive horn longer and straighter than those that we think about. So I tried to look up and do some research on the history of unicorn, and the mythology that we have for unicorn didn't really come about until close to the 1500s. Uh-oh, it may not switch. You may have to switch me one. Okay, so this right here is a mosaic from an Italian church. The Italian church was originally built in the 5th century AD. This particular mosaic dates to 1213. And that's 400 years before the Bible was translated into English and Re'im was translated into unicorn. So it is not impossible for us to say, you know, we know that probably about 99.9% of all the organisms that have ever lived on Earth are already extinct. And we know that over the last 100 years, about 50 species have gone extinct. So it is not unreasonable for us to think that there were animals living during Bible times that are no longer living today. Either something just killed them off, people hunted them to extinction, for various other reasons. We don't really know. But I think it is totally factual for us to say there were animals living in Bible times that are no longer living today. We know that the dodo bird, which died out in the 1500s, it would have been living during Bible times, even if they didn't know where the Galapagos Islands were, and they're not alive today. So, I believe that the behemoth and leviathan are two animals that lived in Bible times that are currently extinct today. If you look at your footnotes in Job 40:15, what does it say that the behemoth probably is? Okay, sometimes it says elephant, sometimes you'll see hippopotamus. If you look at leviathan, a lot of times it'll say a crocodile or a whale. Okay, so I'm going to propose that the behemoth is probably what we learned as kids to be a brontosaurus, now called an apatosaurus or a sauropod. The largest one is like our Argentinosaurus. And the leviathan may have been some sort of aquatic dragon-like thing. I don't know what animal it would be like. But if we look at, I'm going to read Job 40:15 through 24. So 40, I'm going to switch out of the King James. So starting in 15, it says, "Look at behemoth, which I made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox. What strength it has in its loins, what power in the muscles of its belly. Its tail sways like a cedar. The sinews of its thighs are close knit. Its bones are tubes of bronze, and limbs are rods of iron. It ranks first among the works of God." And when he says it ranks first, he says it's the biggest thing I've ever made. So it ranks first among the works of God, yet its maker can approach it with his sword. The hills bring it their produce, and all the wild animals play nearby. Under the lotus plants it lies, hidden among the reeds in the marsh. The lotuses conceal it in their shadow. The poplars by the streams surround it. A raging river does not alarm it. It is secure through the Jordan, though the Jordan should surge against its mouth. Can anyone capture it by the eyes or trap it and pierce its nose? So, considering if it might be a hippo, an elephant, or a dinosaur, says it was made by God at the same time as man. So it would have been made on day 6 when man was made. Could that be a hippo, an elephant, or a dinosaur? Could be either one of them, right? Eats grass. Could it be an elephant? A hippo? Those big old giant dinosaurs like the Apatosaurus were grass eaters. So could be either one of those. Really strong. Elephants are really strong. I've seen them at the circus doing some really neat things. Hippos. Believe it or not, hippos are the deadliest animal in Africa. They are responsible for more human deaths than any other animal because they are extremely strong and extremely unpredictable. So strength could fit any of the three. Tail compared to a cedar. Do you remember what an elephant's tail looks like? I tried to Google cedar of Lebanon. This is the picture I kept coming up with. I don't know if that is truly a cedar of Lebanon, but it is a cedar tree. It is huge. It is big. The elephant's tail does not make me think of a cedar tree. Neither does a hippo's tail. But an Apatosaurus's tail does. And the largest of these sauropods was the Argentinosaurus, which were 120 feet long. So when it swings its tail, I do think of a cedar tree, because that is a massive tail. So moving on, strong bones. Any of them could have strong bones. Strong arms and legs, that fits any of the three. The first or largest of God's creations. Well, that rules out the hippo because the elephant's already bigger. And those dinosaurs were much, much bigger than any elephant I've ever seen as well. So, if dinosaurs are real and we have the bones to prove that they are, the remains, to me it suggests that this is probably a dinosaur based on that. Lives in the marshes. That would fit all three of them. Withstands a raging river. That is supposed to be the Jordan at flood stage. I don't know that it is for sure because, again, I Googled Jordan at flood stage and that's the picture that kept coming up. But we do know that the Jordan does flood because in Joshua 3:15 he says, now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. So we know the Jordan is we know that when rivers are at flood stage, they are very rapid moving and a lot of destructive force within that water. I do not see an elephant or a hippo withstanding this. But a 120-foot sauropod that weighs 100 tons, I don't really see it being bothered by a raging river. And I don't see it drowning because it can lift its long head way up out of the water. So to me, the evidence suggests that the behemoth was probably some sort of long-necked dinosaur. Some of the descriptions just do not fit an elephant or a whale. But even sometimes when people want to interpret the Bible, they want to say, well, dinosaurs died out 64 million years before people, so it can't be a behemoth cannot be a dinosaur. Well, if God created man and animals on the same day and we coexisted, then it can be. I did not make a list like this for, there's one last thing. Can't be captured or tamed. I had a picture last week of a guy riding an elephant. And we have captured and put hippos in zoos. But I don't think a 100-ton dinosaur, I don't really see how you're going to steer it and control it and capture it and move it somewhere. So again, to me, it just doesn't seem like it could be a hippo or an elephant. Yes?
So why do the current people editing the Bible choose to make up the words instead?
Some of it usually, a lot of times has to do with it. If these creatures didn't exist before mankind, then they're fake, and we don't want people to think the Bible is fake, so we're going to put animals that we know.
So they're influenced by modern...
That happens oftentimes, even in biblical literature. Yes?
So if that creature is that large, do you still think that they were hunted to extinction?
I think they could, but I think at that size, some of the theories I saw is that after the flood, the climate change is very different, and that lack of food, lower oxygen levels, a lot of different reasons. You would need massive amounts of food, and after the world has been underwater for a year, it's going to take a while for grass to grow back. And again, animals that large would have been possibly pre-flood, maybe not that size after the flood, but people still knew about them. Because they would have all started out about this big. And whether or not they ever had a chance to grow much larger, we don't know. There's a lot of things about this that unless God reveals it to us, we're just not going to know the answers to.
John,
Yes?
do you think they're using the same method to date those dinosaur bones like they do a rock?
Yes.
And we kind of talk about how those can be wrong.
Yeah, they use the exact same radiocarbon dating, radiometric dating, not carbon, because there's not supposed to be carbon in the bones, in the fossils, but they use the same. And like I say, we know that we have taken known volcanic eruptions and they age out millions of years different than the known eruption date. So I'm not saying that radiometric dating is useless, but there are flaws with the assumptions. And we know there are flaws, and when you read the literature, they know there are flaws, and they try to account for those flaws. but that doesn't mean you can always account for it, so.
Have we found recently like bones that still have
Yes.
fur on them?
They have found blood cells, blood tissue, connective tissue that technically should not be able to exist more than a few hundred years, maybe a few thousand if it's preserved just perfectly, but certainly not millions of years. And some of the finds have been like in 2018, fairly recent.
How can we go 2 weeks talking about dinosaurs and you haven't put Barney up there yet?
Well, you know, I never liked Barney. And my kids never watched Barney, so. I didn't make a list like this for the Leviathan because it's a lot longer, but I want to read about the Leviathan. Your book is going to say most likely a crocodile or a whale. So as you think about a crocodile and a whale, as I read this about Leviathan, and it is Job chapter 41, and it's all 34 verses. Can you pull in Leviathan with a fish hook or tie down its tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through its nose or pierce its jaw with a hook? Will it keep begging you for mercy? Will it speak to you with gentle words? Will it make an agreement with you for you to take it as your slave for life? Can you make it a pet like a bird, or put it on a leash for a young woman in your house? Will traders barter for it? Will they divide it up among the merchants? Can you fill its hide with harpoons or its head with fishing spears? If you this is my favorite part, if you lay a hand on it, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. Any hope of subduing it is false. The mere sight of it is overpowering. No one is fierce enough to rouse it. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has a claim against me that I must pay? Everything under heaven belongs to me. I will not fail to speak of Leviathan's limbs, its strength, and its graceful form. Who can strip off its outer coat? Who can penetrate its double coat of armor? Who dares open the doors of its mouth ringed with fearsome teeth? Its back has rows of shields tightly sealed together. Each is so close to the next that no air can pass between. They are joined fast to one another. They cling together and cannot be parted. Its snorting throws out flashes of light. Its eyes are like the rays of dawn. Flames stream from its mouth. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke pours from its nostrils as from a boiling pot over burning reeds. Its breath sets coals ablaze, and flames dart from its mouth. Strength resides in its neck, dismay goes before it, and folds of its flesh are tightly joined. They are firm and immovable. Its chest is hard as rock, hard as a lower millstone. When it rises up, the mighty are terrified. They retreat before its thrashing. The sword that reaches it has no effect, nor does the spear or the dart or the javelin. Iron it treats like straw, and bronze like rotten wood. Arrows do not make it flee. Sling stones are like chaff to it. A club seems to it but a piece of straw. It laughs at the rattling of the lance. Its undersides are jagged potsherds, leaving a trail in the mud like a threshing sledge. It makes the deeps churn like a boiling cauldron and stirs up the sea like a pot of ointment. It leaves a glistening wake behind it. One would think the deep had white hair. Nothing on earth is its equal, a creature without fear. It looks down on all that are haughty. It is king over all that are proud. Does that sound like a crocodile? Does it sound like a whale? Whales do not have fearsome teeth. And they do not have jagged potsherds of scales or armored skin on the body, and neither do the crocodiles. And people, if you've ever watched Crocodile Hunter on the History Channel, people catch crocodiles all the time on fish hooks. Whales, we harpooned them in rowboats. You know, people in sailboats would get rowboats out and harpoon them. So to me, it doesn't sound, and I've sure never seen any of them breathe fire. And, you know, so that brings up another question, do they really breathe fire? Well, the description says they do. I do not know if they do or not. I do know that we have certain animals. We have an insect called a bombardier beetle. It's got 2 different glands, and when it secretes those 2 different chemicals, they combine together, and it's like acid. And whatever it hits, it burns like fire, but I don't know if this creature had the ability to do that in some way, that when the 2 chemicals came together, you had a thermal reaction that created fire. I don't know. But maybe that's where the myths of dragons breathing fire originated from. So to me, this is more the creature that's being described as a leviathan. You know, it does not sound to me like a crocodile or a whale. It sounds something more along these lines.
Did it live in the water?
Yes.
Lived in the
It
water.
was, you know, because they talk about it, fish hooks and harpoons, and that it churned up the deep. So, you know, like I mentioned,
Because verse 5 also says, can you make a pet of it like a bird?
yeah,
Or put it on a leash for the young women of your house? Well, I don't know what that exactly means, but well, maybe it ruled clear too. We never know.
could be. You know, like I say, I believe that there are animals that were alive in Bible times that are not alive today. You know, for one reason or the other. Environmental change caused them to die out, or they got hunted out, lack of food, lack of reproduction, we don't know. But I do believe there were certainly animals alive 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago that are not currently alive today. So, you know, I mentioned it a while ago, you know, historians and some Bible scholars are so intent on upholding evolutionary science that they're going to use terms like, it's not a unicorn, it's a wild ox. It's not a behemoth, it's an elephant. And it's not a leviathan, it's a whale. Because that fits better. It fits, it makes everything fit together, and then you can say, well, I still believe, I just don't believe in that. But I still believe. So, you know, based on the fact that the Bible is God's inspired word, it tells us that God made all animals and man at the same time. You know, for a lot of people, based on that alone, that's enough. That's all I need to know. You know, and it's been said a couple of times, why is any of this important? There are people out there who they want to believe, but they cannot get past evolution, and they cannot get, because, you know, science says it's a fact. It's not a fact, it's a theory. It's got a lot of evidence, but just like any evidence, there are also some assumptions that are wrong, that have been proven wrong. There are some things that you have to overcome, just like I said, with some of the theories of creation even, the science theories, there are still problems associated with some of it, and they have to be overcome. You know, at some point, we can say they're overcome because God made it happen. But an evolutionist can't say that because they don't necessarily believe that God made any of this happen, and it has to fit. You know, if you don't believe in God, how'd you get here? And you had to have evolved. And that's the only way, because if you didn't evolve, then there had to be a God. You know, we do not have all the answers. And we're actually going to finish a little bit early tonight instead of running 5 minutes late.
Can I ask you something real quick?
Yes.
How much do species evolve over a period of time? I mean, things do change. So
Things do
we've
change,
grown
and
taller and bigger.
it's been in the news recently. And so one thing that makes a species is they're not supposed to be able to breed with each other. Yet we have a blue jay and a green jay that recently bred and created a blue green jay. It looks like a green jay, but it's blue like a blue jay. And that may go back to when Noah had to have one of every kind. And eventually over time, if you get one sort of jay that lives over in this part of the country and another part that lives over here, and their diets change and they eat differently and they have different climates, they eventually develop characteristics that help them survive over here in the east and them over here in the west, and they may begin to look different. And because of winter comes earlier here than here, they may breed later or earlier, and those two, even though they were the same kind, no longer breed anymore. So now they've become two distinct species. That's typically how a lot of that works is, because we have desert fox and Arctic fox. They're both foxes. They don't breed because the Arctic fox lives way up in the Arctic and the desert fox lives way down in the desert. So they're just not in the same place to be able to breed. I don't know if anyone has tried breeding them to see if they still could, but they are considered different species because they look different and they have different behaviors and habitats and stuff.
But because of habitat and changes in habitat, species do, can I say evolve? They do change.
Yeah,
Somewhat.
most people will say that microevolution is no big deal. Over time, we have gone from being 5'7" average height to 5'9", 5'10". We're much taller, and are we evolving? Technically, the term for evolution is you just change your genetic pool. You didn't turn into a new species; you just changed your genetic pool, and certain characteristics show up more often than they used to, and that's considered evolution. If you were to change into a new species, that's speciation.
Yeah.
And we've not observed that ever happen. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but we haven't observed it. But I gave you the example several weeks ago about if I move to Africa, it only takes 4 generations. If I marry into an African family, in 4 generations, my Caucasian look is gone, and 4 generations later, all of my offspring are African. It only takes 3 to 4 generations for that to happen. So I got a couple thoughts. I used to have this as my final thoughts because this was my very last lesson, but since it's not my last lesson, it's just a couple of thoughts. We've been looking at how science, a lot of times science will say God doesn't exist, and here's the science why. Because we evolved, we this, we that, and so God doesn't exist. And if you believe in God, you're foolish for believing in God. That's oftentimes what we're told or what we're made to feel. So I've been trying to show you that there is evidence for creation. It's not just evolution and here it is and accept it or you're stupid. There is actual evidence for creation. There is evidence that supports creation. Some of it is scientific-based evidence. Some of it is cultural. Some of it is historical and archaeological. So, and one of the things is that man's explanation for how we got here is God didn't exist and we evolved. So the problem is the more research we do and the more we learn, the more we realize we got it wrong, and we make changes to certain models and certain theories because it's like, well, we got that part wrong, so we need to add this and add this. And I asked the question, and I read this in a paper, at what point do we finally learn so much that we actually start getting it right? Instead of we learn this and find out, well, that doesn't make sense, so that was wrong, we change it. We've learned this, well, now that's wrong too. At some point we have to, for evolution to be true, at some point we have to start getting it right. And right now, the finer detail and the more we learn, we realize that, yeah, we've got some mistakes in there that have to be addressed. So, I just never liked how when you go to school and you watch a show on National Geographic or something like that, they use terms like evolution has proven. Evolution hasn't proven anything. It has offered a lot of evidence, but it also has a lot of problems. And I can say the same thing, well, this creation research that was done has proven. Well, it hasn't. It has shown evidence, but there are still some problems that have to be worked out. But if I believe the Bible, and it does fit what the Bible said, then perhaps I'm on the right track. You know, part of that about our faith is if we could prove it, then where does our faith come in? You know, we don't need faith because we proved it. So, and anyone who rejects the proof is now foolish. You know, but so we do need faith, and we do need to trust that we have faith that it's that way as well. My other thought is that, well, I've kind of blended them both together, so I don't guess it really matters now. You know, my biggest thing is I want people to see that you don't see the evidence for creation taught in school. You don't see the evidence for creation on National Geographic. But there is evidence there. You know, I'm not saying it's 100% right, but it's as valid, their theories are as valid as evolutionary theories. But modern or mainstream science doesn't want to accept them. You know, one of the things, I found this, and I should have taken down the title of the paper and who wrote it, because I thought it was a really interesting paragraph. Many people think the Bible is just a book about religion or salvation. It is much more than this. The Bible is the history book of the universe, tells us the future destiny of the universe as well, gives us an account of when time began, the main events of history, such as entrance of sin and death into the world, the time when the whole surface of the globe was destroyed by water, the giving of different languages at the Tower of Babel, the account of the Son of God coming as man, his death and resurrection, and the new heavens and earth to come. You know, so we have not only a history book, we have a prophecy book. You know, evolution is trying to tell us about history, of how we connect an unknown past to these fossils and relics we have today. But we have a Bible that tells us how we got to where we are today, and it tells us what's going to happen in the future. And there is no secular future book. There's only a book, you know, we have one book that tells us what's going to be the end final outcome. And, you know, it is a book about religion and salvation, but it's like so much more than that. And, you know, my next lesson, I haven't figured it out exactly yet, but I'm probably going to look at more archaeology type stuff, because I don't really know how much more science I can cover. So you might be getting scienced out. But I'm going to look at a little bit of archaeology. You know, there's a lot of things that people will say, well, the Bible is false because there's no historical evidence of this happening. And then archaeology finds historical evidence. And then archaeology finds more historical evidence. And you find out that even though, you know, once you find that evidence, you go, wow, that's remarkably exactly what the Bible has said for generations. And now we actually have the evidence that supports it. So, like I said, we're going to finish early today. So I'm finished unless anyone has any questions or... And like I said, if there's something particular you would like to hear about, I would love to research it, because I think I'm teaching till the end of November, so I have 5-6 weeks. And I know I have at least 3 or 4 more lessons, so I could definitely use a couple of ideas. So, but that's all I have, so thank you.
The different stages of man's evolution, are those mutations, or are there just so little actual bones and things there that they're just making that all up?
Well, you know, so one paper I read several years ago, the term Neanderthal, someone found, they were digging a tunnel in Neander, France.
Yeah.
They found some bones, and since they were in Neander, and the person who found the bones took them to a biologist, the biologist looked at them and said they're human. And the person who was digging the tunnel, I think, was an engineer, and he said, oh, no, they're not. And he took them several other places. And I think what has been finally determined is that they are human bones that may have suffered from a disease like rickets. But I actually went and found examples online of a Caucasian skull, an African American skull, a Aboriginal skull, And when you put them all up there, you would say, well, that's a monkey, that's a human, and they're all human. They're just different ethnicities, but they're all human, but they look very different. And a lot of the ones that have been found, you don't hear too much about Lucy anymore. I think that has been determined that it's actually an ape species that was just gone extinct and not human. But it was, if I remember correctly, they found a skull, and then they found an actual ape bone about 20 feet away, so they made the connection, but it actually turned out to be an ape species and was not human. So some of this, it's been a while since I've read that, and I may be getting part of that wrong.
I always did wonder if they were just mutated. I mean,
I'll say I'll try and find the picture that has all the different ethnicity skulls, and you can look at them and you would never say they're all human, because they look so different. Yes?
I was wondering if you might mention the Loch Ness as part of your dinosaur discussion.
There's really not any evidence to support it, except for some fuzzy pictures. You know, some of that stuff, I think they could find Bigfoot if they'd fly over the forest with thermal imaging. They ought to be able to find something pretty easily, and apparently Bigfoot likes peanut butter, so why can't they use that for bait? So. I remember when my son was about 8 years old and we were watching a Bigfoot documentary and it was time to go to bed. And he goes, wait, I want to see if they catch one. And I said, oh, trust me, they're not going to catch one.
well, I think that Yeti camping gear is just a moment.
So you think a little life and like the behemoth, they hunted to death?
Either that or it just could no longer sustain itself in the environment that came after the flood.
Are there how they think that their skeletal remains pointing to dinosaurs? Is there anything like that?
No, and so because I deal with fish all the time, I deal with fish kills all the time. In a lake or ocean type system, it's very difficult to rapidly bury something, because typically it's going to die and slowly sink, and then a couple days later it's going to bloat and float back to the surface after it's been dead for about 4 or 5 days. And then if it can't beach itself and then get tore apart by scavengers and bacteria and fungus, it's pretty much going to eventually sink to the bottom again, and bacteria at the bottom of the lake or ocean are going to eat it up and take care of it. And various other scavenger, lobsters, crabs, turtles that eat on detritus off the bottom and stuff too. So, most of the whale fossils they find are in areas that are like right up, and they think that maybe a cliff collapsed underwater and covered them that way, but it's just difficult to get large stuff underwater buried rapidly.
Do you think they were on the ark?
I don't think these were, because I don't think they needed to be.
Right, but do you think the land ones were?
I think so. I think the ones that were still alive were. I don't know that all of them were still alive by that time, but the average, we talked about in Noah's Ark, the average animal size was the size of a sheep, and that the ark had enough room for 100,000 sheep, and we only needed to fit about 35,000. And the average dinosaur size is also about the size of a sheep. There are only a few that were huge, and all we had to have was a juvenile, a year-old juvenile that maybe by the time it got off the ark was, 4 or 5 feet tall, maybe.
This is not about the same thing, but aren't there still being more species, sea creatures being discovered all the time in deep trees?
There's a few. Most of the new species are insects and bacteria, but there are a few fish that pop up every now and then. So, yes? Well, they actually think that octopus must have come from another planet because there's nothing on Earth like it, and they don't think it could have possibly evolved in the time frame they're talking about. They actually proposed a theory that an asteroid hit the Earth and maybe had some octopus DNA on it, and That's an actual real paper I read, so. Because it does not fit the evolutionary timeline in any way. And there is one theory, it's not considered very seriously, but there is a paper that was written in the 70s or 80s that says extraterrestrial beings seeded the Earth. And it's not considered very academically, but it is a paper that is out there.
They all came from Roswell.
Yeah. About 6,000 years ago.
Do you think if a horned toad had lived for a couple hundred years, it would grow into a dinosaur?
I don't know. I mean, it's a guess, really.
They lived for a long time.
I mean, you know, look at, there's some of those Galapagos turtles that have been around practically since the Civil War. And they're enormous. You know, I have seen turtles that are well over 100 years old. And still, if conditions are right, could still live a lot longer. They have found turtles that had musket balls in them from when they were shot back in that time period. And there's lots of animals that they think are extinct, and then they pop up years later and say, oh, we found one, but we thought it was extinct 30 million years ago. So